Today is January the 7th. What was Jesus' childhood like? Let's find out together as we study Matthew chapter 2 and Luke chapter 2. Today, as we get started, we'd like you to read Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 to 23, the entire chapter. And then Luke chapter 2, again, the entire chapter. In these chapters, you'll notice that although they both talk about the birth of Jesus, they tell us quite different stories. Each one tells us a different aspect of the birth of Jesus. We'll start in the Gospel of Luke. In Luke, what we see is the story of the first few weeks of Jesus' life. Chapter 2, 1 to 7 tells us of Jesus' birth. Verses 8 to 19 tells us of the revelation of the angels to the shepherds and how the shepherds came to worship Jesus. Starting in verse 21, something very cryptic to us. 8 days later, when the baby was circumcised, he was named Jesus, the name given him by the angel even before he was conceived. Now, the story of that angel revelation was actually in the book of Matthew, made to Joseph. So, when Jesus was 8 days old, Mary and Joseph went from Bethlehem to Jerusalem, to the temple. They presented Jesus in the temple where he was circumcised, being a good Jew, and then named. Now, why did they wait for 8 days to name him? Child mortality rates were so high at that time that babies were not named until they were 8 days old. At 8 days old, there was a much greater chance that they would actually survive as infants. And so 8 days old was the time when you circumcised your child and gave him a formal name. If you remember in the Old Testament, David and Bathsheba had a son through their illicit affair. That child died 7 days after he was born. He died without a name. There is no name given to that child. When Jesus was 8 days old, they presented him in the temple. And we have the story here of two people, Simeon and Anna, both of whom had received promises from God that they would see the Messiah. And through divine revelation, when Joseph and Mary brought the baby Jesus into the temple, even though neither Simeon nor Anna were functionaries of the temple, they stopped Joseph and Mary where they were and said, "This is the Messiah." Mary remembered all that. There are beautiful prayers and beautiful realities here that come true in Jesus' life. Now, we jump back to Matthew chapter 2. In Matthew chapter 2, after Jesus is born, first of all, it says that the Magi who came visited Jesus in the house. This in chapter 2, verse 11. Enough time had passed that Joseph and Mary were now living in a house. Joseph had time to build a house in which he and his wife were now living. If you followed the devotionals during last year, we mentioned that Joseph probably moved to Nazareth to work on the town of Tiberias, When they went back to Bethlehem for the census. Apparently, they took up residency there, in part because King Herod was also building, just as the town of Tiberias was being built by Roman officials. So Herod was building, specifically at this time, he was building the temple. And so Joseph may have gotten work in constructing the temple at this time. The Magi came seeking the King of the Jews. They went to the current King of the Jews and asked him where his newborn son was, and he said, I don't have a son. The Magi were directed by God to Bethlehem, where they found Jesus living now in a house with his mother and father. King Herod asking the Magi when the star first appeared, getting an answer, then asking the teachers of the law, where is the King of the Jews to be born? They told him Bethlehem. King Herod sent his army to Bethlehem to kill all children 2 years and younger. What this says to us is that this took place after Jesus' birth. Jesus at this point is probably a toddler, under 2 years old. We don't know how many months, but literally months have gone by since his birth. The angel appears to Joseph and Mary, tells Joseph to flee. Even before the sun comes up, Joseph wakes up Mary. He packs their bags, and they take off for Egypt to hide from Herod. Now, at the end of that section, the angel tells Joseph, living now in Egypt, that Herod has died. He confirms that, and then he moves back. But he moves back not to Bethlehem, where he had a house that was a little bit too close to Jerusalem. And Herod's son, also named Herod, could remember what his father did. So Joseph and Mary moved to Galilee, and they go back to the city that Mary was from, Nazareth. Joseph probably begins to work again on the city of Tiberias. Jumping back to the book of Luke, we end in chapter 2, verse 41 to 52, where Jesus is taken to the temple. He would have been taken to the temple when he was between 10 and 13 years old for what is called the bar mitzvah. That is the passage of a Jewish boy from childhood to adulthood. There was no such thing as adolescence in Israel. Once you were no longer a child, you had become an adult. Jesus was now recognized as an adult. He was taken to the temple where he would have done two things. He would have read the Torah in the temple, and he would have made his first sacrifice as a man. Jesus, however, did three things. Apparently, there was a crowd that went down to Jerusalem with Joseph and Mary, whether it was other boys looking for their bar mitzvah as well, or simply the family. They started back home toward Nazareth, and when they got part of the way, they asked each other, where's Jesus? I thought he was with you. Well, I thought he was with you. They went back to the temple and they found Jesus reasoning with the teachers of the law in the temple. When they find him, they ask him, what were you doing? Jesus said, I had to be about my Father's business. Now, obviously, he wasn't talking about Joseph. He was talking about God. Mary would have told him about his miraculous birth. Jesus understood that. Jesus understood that there was a special relationship between him and God. He acted on that. He found out that he was God. He spent hours and hours studying Scripture. And when he got to the temple, he began to ask the teachers of the law questions. Apparently, they couldn't answer him. They were amazed at his wisdom. Next week, when we come back to study Scripture in the New Testament, we begin to see some of that amazing teaching that Jesus taught. Like, follow, and subscribe on whatever platform you use to listen to this podcast. We'll see you in church on Sunday.